A Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. How are you? It's Saturday night. We're starting a new week. Let's light up the darkness for the 300th time. This is our 300th episode of AT Daily. We began on January 5th, and we've learned a new page of the Talmud every day since, thank God, and with your support. Who is with us tonight as we're celebrating our 300th episode and a new week? Paulina from Arkansas, Melissa from Great Neck, Leona Sue says, good evening, friends. Lionel Leventhal, hello, Lionel, says, Mazel Tov on episode 300. Audrey says, Shavua Tov from LA. Harold Black is with us saying shalom. Pamela from Ohio. Michael wishing a Shavua Tov from Jefferson City, Missouri. First time live, but I listened to all the episodes on recording. Great to have you with us, Michael, and live. Awesome. Diane says, once in a blue moon. Did I hear that? There's a blue moon tonight. I'm not even sure what that means, but it's a blue moon. Stephanie says Shavua Tov. Anne from Merced. Arlene is with us. Abba is with us from Brooklyn. Judith from Arizona. And Lynn with us from North Texas. Great to see you all. Where are we holding? Let me get myself together here. We're opening a new chapter. So we are just now beginning chapter 8 of volume 3 of the Talmud. That's tractate Eruvin. We are on Daf Pei Base. That's page 82. Chapter 8, and we're covering the first two. I don't think we're finishing the second Mishna, but we're covering the first Mishna and its discussion and opening the second Mishna. And it looks like today's show is going to be relatively short. So put on your focus cap. And if you have questions or comments, put them in the comments. And I will get to it at the end of the session. All right. Let's read the first Mishnah. How does one participate in the joining of Shabbos boundaries, right? So in case you're with us for the first time, what are we talking about? There are different kinds of Eruvin. An eruv is a joining. Sometimes we join courtyards or we join houses in a courtyard to permit carrying in and out of our houses on Shabbos within a courtyard, which would otherwise be prohibited. And as we've talked before, there's the eruv techumin, the eruv techumin. So this is a joining of the boundaries, meaning that we can only walk, there's a limit on how far we can walk on Shabbos from our dwelling, 2,000 cubits in any direction. If our home is in a city, then we get those 2,000 cubits measured from the city limit. If I want to go more than 2,000 cubits in that direction. Now, the example that I usually give of this is that for Shabbos lunch, I want to go to my friend's house and he is more than 2,000 cubits in this direction from my dwelling, or the city limits if my dwelling is in the city. And since he's, say, 3,000 cubits in that direction, what I want to do is change my official Shabbos dwelling from my house to a point in between us so that I'm walking, let's say, the first 1,000 cubits to reach my official dwelling for this Shabbos, and then the next 2,000 cubits to get to my friend's house. That's the example that I always give. Today we're going to qualify that example a little bit. It still works, but we're going to talk a little bit about my reason for going to my friend's house for Shabbos lunch, as we'll see in a minute. But the key is that when I change my dwelling, and I can do that either by depositing a basket of food at a safe place where I want my dwelling to be, or by putting my body there, actually being there when Shabbos begins. Excuse me. Then I would acquire that spot as my dwelling. And let's say for those first 1,000 cubits that I'm walking on Shabbos, I'm actually walking toward my dwelling, even though I started in my house. And then the 2,000 cubits beyond that will get me to where I need to go. What do I lose? Since my dwelling is 1,000 cubits in that direction, if I change my mind and wanted to walk that way, Now I can only go 1,000 cubits in that direction. I no longer have the full 2,000 in that direction. So we've covered this principle before, but now we're going to get into some interesting nuances about it. How does one participate in the joining of Shabbos boundaries? One who wishes to establish a joining of a Shabbos boundary for himself and others, right? So normally you're doing this for yourself. Now, if other people would like you to do it for them so that you can be their agent and you can deposit some food on their behalf, and as we learned yesterday, which is their food, they have to have possession of that food, and then it has to be technically theirs, and then you can deposit it in the basket for them and create an eruv for those people. But you cannot do it without their knowledge, without their awareness. Unlike a joining of courtyards or a merging of alleyways, where people get a larger area, not for walking, but for carrying, and they don't lose anything. So when it's an eruv hatzeros, an eruv of the joining of the courtyard, so that the area where they're allowed to carry things on Shabbos is larger, since they don't lose anything by that, we're allowed to have their, contribute to the eruv for them so that they're participating in it and get the benefit of it, even without their awareness, since they don't lose anything. But this kind of eruv, where I'm going to change somebody's Shabbos dwelling, they must be aware that you're doing it, or it's not effective. All right. So one who wants to establish a joining of Shabbos boundaries for himself and others places a barrel of food in the location that he designates as their place of residence, and says, right, he makes a declaration, this is for all the residents of my town, for anyone who wishes to go on Shabbos to a house of mourning or to a house of a wedding feast situated beyond the Shabbos limit. Anyone who accepted upon himself while it was still day, in other words, on Friday before Shabbos began, that he will rely on the eruv is permitted to rely upon it. But if one only did so after nightfall, he is prohibited to rely upon it, as the principle is that one may not establish an eruv after nightfall on Shabbos. In other words, after Shabbos has begun on Friday night. So right away, we've got some problems here, right? We said, well, you can't establish an eruv without someone's awareness. But here I'm saying, I'm going to go there, I'm going to put some food down, and I'm going to say, anyone in my town. So clearly, it's not like everybody in the town knows that I am depositing this barrel of food in that location. But look at the wording of the Mishna. Not everyone in my town, now this is their dwelling. Rather, anyone in my town who wishes to rely on this eruv may do so. So what you're doing is you're creating a barrel of food that's going to have a bunch of food in it, and people are going to have the option when they hear about this, when they learn about it, to say, yes, I want that eruv to be my eruv. Note also that the wording of the Mishnah is very particular. It said, one who wishes to rely on this eruv techumin, this eruv of joining the Shabbos boundaries, for the purpose of going to a house of mourning or the house of a wedding feast. We're going to have a halacha based on that. Who is it? It's Rav Yosef who teaches, make sure I got that right. Rav Yosef teaches that you can change your Shabbos dwelling so that you can walk further in that direction, right? Shift your dwelling by depositing a basket of food in the location where you prefer your Shabbos dwelling to be, only for the purpose of a mitzvah. To go to a house of mourning, in other words, to go to a Shiva house, right, where people, they lost a loved one and they're sitting Shiva for the 7 days, to attend the rites of mourning after a death, right, a Jewish funeral practice, or to go to a wedding, because it's a commandment to attend the dead to to their grave and to visit a house of mourning, and it's a commandment to rejoice with the bride and groom, in other words, to go to a wedding. And these become examples of a slightly more general principle, which is to fulfill a commandment. Now, if I just want to go to my friend's house for lunch, Am I fulfilling a commandment? No, not really. It's good we're delighting in Shabbos. There's that general principle. We go to each other's houses. If you actually have people over to your house for Shabbos, then you are providing hospitality for visitors. And that is a commandment. But going to someone's house may or may not be. Now, this principle that it's only a valid eruv for the purpose of changing the Shabbos dwelling, so I can go further, an eruv to techumin, joining the boundaries. I can only do that for a mitzvah. That's according to Rav Yosef. Did that become the law? Not exactly. Let's actually read how Rav Schneinstaltz words the law on this. The halacha is, one may establish a joining of Shabbos boundaries only for the purpose of a mitzvah. For example, to celebrate a wedding or to go to a mourner's house, to greet one's teacher or student, or to run from danger. So all kinds, to save a life, to save your own life, to go greet your teacher or to teach Torah, to attend a funeral, or to go to a wedding. Some kind of mitzvah, some kind of commandment is being fulfilled. Nonetheless, if one establishes an eruv for an everyday purpose, the eruv is valid. So it's very interesting. It's only valid if you do it for a mitzvah, but if you don't do it for a mitzvah, it's still valid. So what do we learn from that? You could do it for any reason, but it's definitely preferable to not go doing this all the time just out of convenience, right? And there's many mitzvahs that it's possible to fulfill on Shabbos, having to do with rejoicing in God's holy day and thanking God for creating the world, etc. You're commanded to pray, so if you go that way so that you can pray with other people, and especially if you're going to be the 10th man at a minyan so that they can pray with a quorum, so all the better. All the better, right? So it seems like what we're learning here is, well, you could do it for any reason, but much better to do it so that you're fulfilling a mitzvah, as Rav Yosef taught. Another important teaching that we get out of this is note also the wording, and this is for all the residents of my town, says the one who's establishing the eruv. For anyone who wishes to go on Shabbos to a house of mourning or to the house of a wedding feast. Note that he says a house of mourning before the house of a wedding feast. That order matters. What do we learn from it? The Mishna mentions a house of mourning before a house of a wedding feast in accordance with the verse from Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Why? I think anyone would agree. It is vitally important to go to weddings, to go to simchas, to go to community celebrations, to be there with the people you care about when they're celebrating the happiest days of their lives. It's vital. But it is even more vital to be with them in the day of their sorrow, when they have lost someone and they need to know that people care. They care about the one who is gone from this world and they want to pay their respects, and they care about the mourners who need to be comforted. And not only that, but Kohelet, the one speaking, the voice of Ecclesiastes, in other words, King Solomon is the author of Ecclesiastes. King Solomon is telling us, and he's the wisest person who ever lived, that in his experience, you will grow more in wisdom from attending a house of mourning than from attending a celebration. And that, is instinctively, intuitively, perhaps obviously true. And if it's not obvious, let it sink in. It's for sure true. Because when we're at a feast, it's beautiful. We have a great time. We make memories. When we go to a house of mourning, we are reminded that tomorrow is not promised for anyone. And it causes us to reevaluate our priorities and to say, what am I doing in this world? What am I doing in this life? How do I want to be remembered when, God forbid, it's my funeral and people are telling stories about me? What will they be saying? What kind of a life am I leading? Of course, we learn more when we go to the House of Mourning. And that's why it is mentioned first in our Mishnah. With regard to this actual formulation, the Mishnah says that one who wants to participate in the eruv must accept upon himself while it is still day on Friday. Now, this is the case where, let's say that all our homes are in a town, right? So now, since we live in a town, we all get the same measure in terms of how far we can walk in that direction because our Sabbath boundary begins at the edge of the town. So all the houses in the town have the same Shabbos boundary. So now somebody hears, okay, there's a funeral. It just happened this morning on Friday. There's going to be, going to the House of Mourning on Saturday. A lot of people are going to want to go. And it's, 3,000 cubits away from the town limit. And so this one guy, enterprising, smart, good-natured guy, says, I'm going to make sure everyone in the town has the option to go there on Shabbos, because normally they can't unless we make this eruv techumin. So he goes out there, he puts the barrel, and he says, I'm establishing this for the residents of our town. Anyone who wants to participate in it may do so. He puts the barrel down. He comes back to town. The word gets out. There's a barrel out there. Anybody who wants to be included in that eruv, they've established their Shabbos dwelling in that barrel in its location, so they can make it to the House of Mourning on Saturday. Now, here's the deal. Here's what the Mishnah is saying to us, and as the Gemara explains. You must hear about it while it's still day on Friday. If you're not sure whether you're going to go or not, because maybe you've heard there's going to be a Torah lecture in the other direction, and you're not sure if you want to shift your dwelling that way, because then you'll be precluded from going to hear that lecture, so you're thinking about it. As long as you heard that the barrel was deposited in that location while it's still daytime on Friday, you can actually make the choice to rely on it after Shabbos begins, owing to the principle of retroactive clarification. Meaning, you weren't sure, but you were thinking you're probably going to go that way. And so after Shabbos begins, you can't establish an eruv after Shabbos begins. But this eruv was established before Shabbos started. You just weren't sure if you were going to participate in it, but you were thinking you might. And then you say, I really intended to do this all along. That is okay. But if you only hear about the eruv after Shabbos began, then no. Then you cannot rely on it. It's too late, because for you, from your perspective, the eruv was not established before Shabbos began. So the principle is, as long as you hear about the fact that you have this possibility before Shabbos starts, you can actually elect to take advantage of it even after Shabbos begins. And that's per the opinion of Rav Ashi. Rav Asi is also going to tell us that for a child up to and including the age of 6, he doesn't have to have food in the barrel. He doesn't have to do anything. He's included with his mother because he's so dependent on his mother. He or she is so dependent on the mom that a child up to and including 6 years old doesn't have to make a separate contribution. But from that, we learn that a child 7 years old and up, they have to have their own, food in the barrel, or be designated as part of the owners of the food in the barrel on their own. And that means with their awareness. The child has to know. It can't be done on the child's behalf. And that's our discussion of Mishnah number 1. And now we're going to open our discussion of Mishnah number 2, and then we're going to get to comments and questions. As I said at the beginning, this is going to be a fairly short show. Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 8 is also about Eruvin techumin, so the joining of the Shabbos boundary. And now we're talking a little bit more specifically about the food in that barrel that we're going to use. What is the measure for a joining of Shabbos boundaries? It consists of a quantity of food sufficient for 2 meals for each and every one of those included in the eruv. Now, the Tanaim disagree with regard to the size of these two meals. It is referring to one's food that he eats on a weekday and not on Shabbos. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says it is referring to the amount he eats on Shabbos and not on a weekday. And both this sage and Rabbi Meir and that sage, Rabbi Yehuda, intended to be lenient, meaning they were intending to require the smaller amount. But Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir says that people normally eat less on a weekday than they do on Shabbos. And Rabbi Yehuda says actually people eat less on Shabbos than they do on a weekday. As Rabbi Meir maintains that people eat more food on Shabbos, and Rabbi Yehuda believes they consume more on a weekday. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says, food for 2 meals. How much food is enough food for 2 meals? Like, it's not going to be like a big lavish meal. It's like, how much do you actually need for 2 meals? Food for 2 meals is the size of a loaf of bread bought with a pundion, which is 1/48 of a selah. So it's a very small amount of money. When 4 sah of wheat are sold for a selah. So we're not going to get into the math of this, but basically it's enough food that, how much is 2 meals? It's enough that it can be bought with this small amount of money. And Rabbi Shimon says, food for 2 meals is 2 of 3 parts of a loaf when 3 loaves are prepared from a kav of wheat. In other words, the measure is 2/3 of a loaf, the size of 1/3 of a kav. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka is giving an amount of food based on how much can be purchased for money when the price of wheat is at a certain price. And Rabbi Shimon is saying, why do we have to bring money into it? Let's just say it's enough food based on a loaf of bread when a loaf of bread is made from a certain volume of wheat. Having discussed measures with regards to a loaf of bread, the Mishna states that half of this loaf is the amount called a half, a measure relevant for the halachas of a leprous house. And if one enters a house afflicted with leprosy and remains there long enough to eat this amount of food, the clothes he is wearing become ritually impure. Is that interesting? A volume of food now becomes a measure of time. Because when you enter a house where the house has tsaras, they translate it as leprosy, but it's not like modern leprosy. It's actually where the house has sort of blotches that come out on the walls. This doesn't exist in our world anymore. It's actually a fairly miraculous manifestation in the ancient kingdom of Israel that sometimes houses would have a breakout, usually because there was lashon hara, evil tongue, gossip being spoken in that house, occasionally as a benefit to the residents that we could talk about another day. But the point is that you enter such a house, and if you're there as long as it takes to eat half a loaf of bread, then you've contracted tuma from that house, not the leprosy, but just ritual impurity, and you're going to have to immerse in a mikvah and be purified before you're permitted to eat, teruma, or to enter the grounds of the Temple Mount. Okay, so that's the Mishnah. And so what we saw is, all right, the basic idea is everyone who's participating in this eruv to change his Shabbos dwelling for the purposes of in which direction, how far he can walk on Shabbos, has to contribute 2 meals worth of food, for himself, from his possession. Now, somebody can gift him the food, and sort of it can be received by an agent as long as he's aware of it. He doesn't have to literally go there and put food in the barrel, but food that has to be assigned to him, the possession of that food has to be conveyed to every person, and then an agent can do it for them, but food on their behalf has to go into that barrel. And what is the minimum measure? 2 meals worth of food. And here we saw a few different formulas of how we understand what the volume is of 2 meals worth of food. We had this basic disagreement between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Are we talking about 2 meals worth of food on a weekday or 2 meals worth of food on Shabbos? Now, with respect to this question, Rav Yosef said to Rav Yosef, the son of Rava, your father, in accordance with whose opinion does he hold? That of Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Meir? Right, with 2 meals of weekday meals or Shabbos meals. And Rav Yosef, the son of Rava, replied. So he's talking about his father, Rava, how he holds. And so Rav Yosef, the son of Rava, replied, well, my father, Rav, holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Well, Rav Yosef added, I too agree with the ruling of Rabbi Meir, because if the halakha is in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda, a difficulty would arise from the popular saying, there is always room for sweets. I love that saying. Because, right, you have your stomach, and then you have your dessert stomach. So no matter how big a meal you had, how stuffed you are, if they bring out a beautiful, tasty dessert, somehow you have enough room for it. And since we embellish our meal on Shabbos, right? We embellish the meal on Shabbos, and whereas during the week we might not have dessert, but on Shabbos you gotta have a dessert. You gotta have lots of appetizers and a beautiful main course, and then of course you're gonna have a dessert. So it would seem that the meals of Shabbos are bigger. And indeed, Rav Yosef says, difficulty would arise from the popular saying, there is always room for sweets. It is generally accepted that one dining on delicacies eats more, and therefore the amount of food in Shabbos meals is greater than that of weekdays, as they include more sweet foods. And there you go. And if we just read like how the law came out on these questions, here's the halacha, an eruv, and then I'm going to your comments and questions. An eruv of Shabbos boundaries must consist of food sufficient for 2 meals for each person included in the eruv, and the measure for 2 meals is an amount of bread equal in volume to 6 egg bulks. That's where they came out. The amount of volume of an egg times 6, that's what 2 meals is. And some authorities rule that the amount must be equal to the volume of at least 8 egg bulks, and this measure applies to both an average person and a gluttonous one. However, an elderly or a sick person who tend to eat less, their eruv can be established with a smaller amount of food. That's what I've got for us today. Let's check comments and questions. Lynn in North Texas says, a blue moon means a second full moon in a single month. Happy 300, been with you since the start, and it is the best book club I have ever been in. Have written the dates and daf numbers in my Talmud Bavli Shas, in her edition of the Talmud. Just love and depend on the broadcast. Grateful. Lynn, it's so great that you're here. Your comments are always very helpful. Yes, just the right questions and make just the right comments, and really helps everyone understand. So thank you for being part of the community. And Sylvia says, happy to see your great smile. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Thanks to everybody. It's great learning with you. And may we merit to be so blessed as to complete this journey and make it all the way through. You know, here we are on the 300th page of our 2,711 page journey. We'll complete the first year with God's help on January 5th. So that gives you a sense of where we are and where we're holding. But it is great learning with you. And without a doubt, even though I've done this whole journey before, it's one thing to learn it. It's another thing to learn it, to teach it. And I mean, I'm learning so much more by preparing every day to teach it for you. I bit off more than I expected. You know, I thought it was initially just going to be like a 15-minute review of 1 or 2 key concepts. We still don't do the whole page at the level of depth that I like to go into, and assuming no prior experience of our viewers, it just would be impossible to do every concept on the page. But I do try to cover all the most important concepts on every page. And it seems like we're all learning together and kind of breaking through our previous limits of knowledge. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers, and have a